Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and we have a non-interview episode today, which is always exciting. Interview episodes are exciting for their own reasons. Non-interview episodes are exciting for their own reasons. I hope you enjoy them equally as much. So today I thought I would talk about Little House on the Prairie, the series Little House on the Prairie, because the other day when I did an episode before Mother's Day, it wasn't as close to Mother's Day as it might have been because of scheduling, etc. I talked about reading Little House with my mom and the way she used to tease me in about a certain part of the Little House book. So I had always meant to do a love letter to Little House, and now I've finally sitting down to actually do this episode. So I don't know if you grew up reading the Little House books or if you grew up watching Little House on the Prairie on TV. I grew up doing both. Little House on the Prairie was on in syndication after school for a while during my growing up years, so I got to watch that after school, which I loved for very different reasons. And I loved the book because even while I loved the series, I was also very, very conscious of how different it was from the books, and I was always comparing the two. So I loved them both for different reasons. But I started reading Little House on the Prairie, I think, in about first grade, because it was either first or second grade. I remember lying in bed one night. I was allowed to read before I went to sleep. And I was so proud of myself because I had read like 11 pages. I had read that many pages before it was time to go to bed, and I was just so proud of myself for reading so many pages. And I look back at myself and I think, oh, you were just so adorable. Although now if I have time to read 11 pages before bed or before falling asleep, that's also a victory. So it's just a victory for different reasons. At any rate, I was about first or second grade, and my sister had the series. She and I shared a room, so they were on the bookshelf in our room. And so I started with Little House in the Big Woods and moved on from there. I absolutely insisted that I had to read Farmer Boy third, because that's the way it was listed in my series. My mom kept saying, you don't have to read it in order. That's about Almanzo, and that's a totally different story. It doesn't go along with the chronology of the series. And I was insistent. Nope, that's the way it's listed. I have to read Little House on the Prairie, and then I have to read Farmer Boy, and only then can I move on to the fourth Little House book. Or the third Little House book, technically, I guess, fourth in the series. I was adamant. And I really love Farmer Boy too. I love getting to it's so different because it takes place in such a different place. Almanzo, who later grows up after he's Farmer Boy in this book, grows up to marry Laura, and he lived in upstate New York, and his family was fairly well off. They had a house with wallpaper. I was fascinated by the descriptions of the root cellar where they kept their food. They had an ice house. They were very, very much better off than Laura's family, who lived kind of a nomadic experience. They moved a lot. They lived literally in the middle of nowhere. So very different experiences. And I really loved seeing that experience that Almanzo had as a child. And, but I insisted on reading them in order. So I had to read Almanzo's story in the place that it was listed in my books. at any rate. I'm trying to remember if when I read them as an adult, if I did it, I'm 90% sure that I went ahead and read it in the same spot that I always read it, just for continuity, you know? So anyway, I started reading Little House as a very young child. Started with Little House in the Big Woods, and I'd already seen Little House the series at that point, because I remember thinking, oh wow, this isn't Little House on the Prairie, this is Little House in the Big Woods. And Laura is about 5, and they still live in the big woods of Wisconsin, where there's lots of family, so they get to spend time with that family. They're much less isolated than they are in the later books, and so you get to see their family and really get to see what they leave behind. And then in the next book, they decide to leave and go find a different life. And so they pack everything into their covered wagon, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. 2 young children and a baby, Mary, Laura, and Carrie, plus Ma and Pa, plus their dog Jack, all as many belongings as they can fit into the covered wagon, plus supplies, obviously, for the journey. And then they set out by themselves. And I was always pretty impressed they went by themselves. I grew up in Montana, so I grew up learning about Lewis and Clark and wagon trains and those sorts of things, and I always figured wagon trains, right? They would go together, but in the stories, the Ingals family went by themselves. So they go to Kansas and they set up their house, or they build a house, they dig a well, they do everything they have to do. And at the end of the story, it turns out that it doesn't say this specifically, but they were squatting. They were not allowed. They shouldn't have been living where they were living. And we'll get to some of that a little bit later. Then there's Farmer Boy, which I already discussed. And then the series goes on. So you see Laura's life. And I grew up reading these books and being obsessed with them. If you haven't read them, you should. They're wonderful. I'm not going to go through and list the entire series and tell you what each one is about. But they do follow this family as they keep moving. I mean, they move again from Kansas to, I believe, Minnesota, on the banks of Plum Creek, I think, is in Minnesota. And then they move to North Dakota. They pretty much stay in North Dakota for the rest of the series. There's several books that take place when they are homesteading in De Smet, North Dakota. And I grew up in western Montana, but I know about eastern Montana, which is very similar to North Dakota and South Dakota, and the winters are just brutal, and I cannot imagine living in a tiny, tiny shack in the dead of winter. No, thank you. I mean, homesteaders were incredibly hardy stock. They were amazing people, and wow, just the courage it took to pack up your belongings and leave. So I grew up thinking, this was Laura Ingals Wilder's life. This was what happened to her as a child. And then it wasn't until later that I realized, or I learned, that the books are fictionalized. Some of them really are about her life, but a lot of things have been changed or redone for the children's books. They aren't exactly what her life was like, and I remember being just shocked. And actually, I encountered a little bit of this as a child before I really learned fully that they were fictionalized, because I remember reading, my parents had 2 books that were written after the series, and the last book in the series is The First 4 Years, which is also very different from the rest of the series, very differently written, and that's about Laura's and Almanzo's first 4 years of marriage, and it is very differently written. But then there was some other books that included letters and different things about their lives, and talked about their move from North Dakota to Missouri when she was an adult, and they'd had a child. They had Rose, and that I could never quite get into those books as much as I got into the Little House books, and I think because they weren't fictionalized, so they weren't to me, maybe as exciting. It was harder for me to read. I look back on that and I think, yeah, you were starting to realize that the world isn't always what it looks like. The world isn't always what it seems to be. And then another reason that I knew that the books didn't tell the whole story was an article that I read in a magazine that my mom had. And I'm going to tell you about that after the break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Today I am calling this episode My Love Letter to the Little House, because I grew up loving all things Little House. It is actually still a dream of mine to go to some of the places that they have on historic, as historic landmarks, especially in De Smet. And I think there's one in Kansas. More on that later. But I've always loved Little House on the Prairie. But before the break, I was talking about an article that I read in a magazine that my mom had, and to be honest, I don't remember what the magazine was. I don't know how old I was. I was younger than I am now, obviously, not a teenager, probably 10. Let's go with 10. And it talked about some of the things that Laura Ingals Wilder had felt were too mature, too difficult to put into a children's book. And this was the first inkling I had, really, that the books that I had been reading, and I don't know how many times I read the series growing up, but it was a lot. It was definitely one of my go-to favorites, my standbys for reading. But I wish I could find the article, because I know I'm probably remembering parts of it incorrectly. You know how you read something as a kid and maybe you don't understand everything, but it talked about during their travels somewhere they came across a house, a farm, something, and the field was plowed. There weren't any crops growing in the field. It was kind of an odd time for there not to be crops growing in it, for it to be freshly plowed. And one thing led to another, and they discovered, I don't know if the Ingalls family discovered this or if it came out later, but it turns out that there were a family living there who were taking people in as guests maybe and murdering them and then burying them in the field that was then always plowed. Now, again, I don't remember how accurately I am recalling this article, but it freaked me out. I was really glad that she didn't put that in the books, because I was a very sensitive kid and it freaked me out and I didn't like it at all. But that was my first indication that there are things that are not in the books. And then later in life, I read more articles, or I read more information on Laura and how she wrote them as a fictionalized version of her life, that there were things that she didn't include. There were things that she maybe embellished or took out altogether or added altogether, but that it was based on her life, but not, obviously she doesn't come out and say that her father was squatting on their land in Kansas. She writes about how he was homesteading and maybe he did go through the proper channels of getting the permit, but the government may have been complicit in that. I don't know exactly the history, unfortunately. There are, as time has gone on, as time does, and people start looking at things more critically or in new ways, I know there are some complaints, some issues taken with the Little House books. One of them is with Little House on the Prairie and the fact that they were a family of white people squatting in Native American territory. Again, I didn't understand that as a child. I grew up very close to the Blackfoot Indian Reservation, and So them living near Native Americans didn't seem odd to me. When they were scared of the Native Americans, I just thought that they were scared white people. I didn't understand that. I understood when they were scared by the drums, because I had heard drums in a certain way that gives you kind of a whew feeling. There are basketball teams in Montana who, when they go to state basketball championships, will do drumming beforehand, and it can be really intimidating. It's really cool, but it can be really intimidating. So growing up, I just kind of thought, well, yeah, of course they'd be scared. They're in the middle of nowhere, and there are people who are trying to scare them. So again, I didn't understand it, and I understand now more that they were white people living where they shouldn't be. They were breaking treaties that the government had made with the tribes of that area, all kinds of badness. And I didn't understand that when the group of Indians filed past their house and Laura watches them go, I didn't understand what all of that meant. So it definitely opened my eyes to things later. And I read these usually by myself. So if I didn't ask questions, I didn't really talk to my parents too much about them. I maybe could have gotten a better history lesson had I asked questions. But and there's also a part where, as they're walking by, Laura sees a little Native American baby in the cradle board, and she says, "Pa, I want that baby. Go get me that baby." And people are horrified by this. And it is pretty they're horrified by this little white girl who wants her pa to go steal her an Indian baby. Again, as a child, I didn't take it that way. I loved babies. I still love babies. I was drawn to babies like a magnet. If there was a baby in a room, I would want to be playing with it. I would want to be looking at it. I would want to be, as near as possible to that baby. So it just made sense. Laura saw this adorable baby, and she wanted to play with it. She wanted it to be close to it. I don't know exactly what grown-up Laura might have been thinking when she wrote that, because I was reading it from a child's perspective about a child's reaction. So a grown-up Laura writing a fictionalized account where she wants the little white girl to have the native baby, yes, that can lead to some there's badness there. I hope, though, that people don't discount these books out of hand because of that, because they were written from a certain perspective by a woman who grew up in a certain time. They can definitely open conversations. Well, why were the Indians leaving? What was going on? They can open up broader conversations, because we don't always talk about that aspect of our history in schools. We don't always talk about what happened and how treaties were broken and tribes were forced to move, etc. So I actually think that can be a good thing if there is discussion involved. And you know as well as I do that those conversations can come from almost any reading material if you know what your children are reading and you have conversations about it, etc. It doesn't mean that you police what they read to a major certain extent. Obviously, you make those decisions in your own family, but being able to talk about them, and if you have read a book that your child is reading, you can ask questions about it. So that's there's some difficult things in there, and more difficult things later. They keep moving. They move to North Dakota. There's some questionable things that happen, I'm sure, there, but it's still a wonderful series of adventure, and a little girl who goes on those adventures, and you watch her grow up. And there are so many things that I loved about the series. I talked about the root cellar in Farmer Boy, and I was fascinated with the imagery of that growing up. I was fascinated by Pa building the log cabin and how that process worked, how they just moved to the middle of the prairie and built a home, dug a well, all of those things. I was fascinated. I was fascinated by Laura going off to teach school at 16. And when she came back from teaching school, she had to go back to school. And she was expected to have her homework done the first day she got back. I was amazed by that. I did not understand why you would be expected to have your homework done when you weren't there to get the assignment in the first place because you were off teaching school somewhere else. There's so many things that I love about that book. And it was really my maybe my first, if not my first, definitely one of my first experiences with historical fiction, with learning about a different era in history, and I was definitely hooked. I think it was partly the Little House series and partly my grandmother that had me maybe not completely obsessed, but definitely fascinated by button hooks that you use to fasten your shoes. I don't really need shoes with buttons that require a button hook, but I was fascinated as a kid. My grandmother actually had a button hook, and I so wanted to wear shoes that had buttons that required button hooks. I'm older now, I don't need that, but it definitely led me to a lifelong fascination of a lot of things, up to and including dressing like Laura for Halloween one year, and I even posted this on Twitter a while back. My mom made me a sunbonnet, not for Halloween, just because I wanted a sunbonnet. Thank you very much. I had to have a sunbonnet because of the Little House books. So then one year I was Laura for Halloween because I already had a sunbonnet. And then my dad set up a little photo shoot outside in our backyard in front of his garage/shop that had old weathered boards. I think they may have even been reclaimed barnwood. I do not know. And my mom had an old apple cider press, and so just set up this old-fashioned-y looking. I also had a pinafore because I had to have a dress that had a pinafore. At this age, also, I had to have a sunbonnet, and I had to have a pinafore, which led to my Laura Ingals outfit for Halloween. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have a little more love for Little House. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my love letter to Little House. I was actually thinking about several things over the break, one of which was my earlier conversation about Native Americans in Little House on the Prairie, and I do actually remember a conversation I had with my mother. I don't know if it was necessarily related to Little House, but my mother's grandmother, maybe, I think, was possibly Cherokee. Growing up, Mom said that her mother told stories about, it was on my grandfather's side. I apologize. It was on my grandfather's side. At any rate, it was a previous grandmother who may or may not have had Cherokee blood, and she didn't talk about it because at the time that she was growing up and at the time her children were growing up, the phrase was, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, which is a terrible, horrible phrase. But I do believe we talked about it in the context of Little House because I didn't understand things like when the Indians came to the door and Ma was scared of them and the way other people talked about them at other points in the books. And Mom told me that phrase just to give me an idea of how they were perceived as a people, how they were perceived as, savages, etc. How I'm sure it was toned down to my age level, but I do remember her talking about that. And so it brought it into perspective for me, because it gave me some family history and how someone wouldn't want to reveal that they had any Native American ancestry, because of the prevailing stereotypes of the day, made it a little more understandable to me. I also was searching through a few websites and things on Laura Ingalls, and I did find a reference to that article that I was referring to about the graves, the freshly plowed field. And what I had forgotten was that Pa was a member of a vigilante team that went after them. They were the Bender family, and Pa, according to Laura's interview, would say whenever their names would come up in terms of people looking for them or thinking that they had spotted them years later, Pa would just say in a very final voice, "No one's ever going to find them." So, yeah, you can understand why she wouldn't want to put Pa as a vigilante in the books. So, that was, as I mentioned, that was just kind of my introduction to things might not be as you think they are in the Little House books. But there are a million trillion, that might not even be hyperbole, but there are so many books written about Laura Ingalls, about the Little House books. There's all kinds of companions for reading the Little House series with your children, talking about the issues that are brought up, not just Native Americans, but life, as it was then. There's all kinds of guides for reading it in the classroom, etc. So there are definitely ways to talk to your children about this book if you are concerned about them reading the Little House series, but still want them to read the books because you have nostalgic feelings of them from your childhood, etc. There's also, biographies and autobiographies, and I am embarrassed to admit that I still haven't read Pioneer Girl, although I want to. It's on my to-be-read list. I just haven't gotten there yet, so it's, that to-be-read list. Maybe yours is just as long. It's probably longer, but that is on my list, and I will get to it one of these days because I do love it. But there's also memoirs of people. I mentioned earlier that I really someday would love to go to some of the places that have the Laura Ingals Wilder historical sites in North Dakota, in Missouri, in Kansas, etc. There are people who have made entire trips on this. There's maps that you can follow that will show you the way to follow the family's trail, or the easiest way to hit all the sites. There's people that do this. They go every year to the Laura Ingals Wilder. I don't know if it's days or whatever festivities that they have. And I actually read a book by Wendy McClure. I had to look it up. Thank goodness I keep track of all of my books because I could not remember the name. It's called The Wilder Life. And she, like me, was obsessed with Little House as a small child, or as a young person. And she decided to not exactly follow the trail exactly like you find on some of those, but she went to a lot of the places. She tried churning her own butter. She went to a community that was living kind of the way she thought the pioneers might live, but it turned out that they were a group of preppers, so it wasn't exactly what she was looking for. The book is hilarious, and it brought out a lot of the reasons that I love the Little House books, and it was so much fun to go into this world with someone else who loved them as much as I did, and watch her experience things. And since I haven't been able to visit the sites myself, it was really fun to read those. But like I said, there's a million books out there if you want to continue reading Little House as an adult. Obviously, you can read Pioneer Girl, which will give you a more accurate picture of Laura's life, rather than the fictionalized version. There are a million articles out there, so if you want to read more about ways that people are concerned about the Little House books and how they portray various aspects of growing up in that time, how they portray the Native population, etc., you can read about that. You can read about reading them with your children, reading them in the classroom. So many different options, and you can just get lost in the world of Little House. In fact, as I was looking through a bunch of things, A, trying to remember the name of the book that I was just speaking about, The Wilder Life, B, trying to look up a few things on Laura Ingalls. And we haven't even talked about Laura and Rose. Rose Wilder Lane is her daughter. She actually helped Laura write the books, probably wrote them. Laura told her the stories. They had a contentious relationship. I mean, there's so much. and I lost my train of thought as to where I was going, except that there are a million books out there, autobiographies, books about Laura, books about Laura and Almanzo, books about Rose's life. And, she grew up in an interesting time because she was born in that prairie pioneering world, but then her family moved to Missouri. She lost her savings in the stock market crash that preceded the Depression. She had a very kind of difficult and sad life in some ways, and also kind of a fascinating life in others. So there's also, there's cooking, like there's Little House cookbooks, there's sewing like they do in Little House. There are so many books of ways to get into the Little House world. And then there are books about, then there are memoirs from the TV show. So a lot of the actors on the TV show have written memoirs of about what that was like and what Little House means to them. Obviously slightly different. I kept seeing the book Out of the Mouth of Ma, searching for Caroline Ingalls, so there's so much more to know about this family and this story, and it's my love letter to Little House, because I will, I'm sure, read the series more times in my life, and I will continue reading books about the books and about Laura, and fiction about the books, just spin-offs, whatever. I'll continue to read. So thank you, Laura Ingals Wilder. I love your series, and even if it was about a time that now has some problems, you were a huge part of my childhood, and I will be forever grateful to that. So thank you to Laura Ingals Wilder. Thank you to you for tuning in and listening to me ramble about books. I love books. I love Little House. I love my listeners. Lots of L's in that statement. So thanks for tuning in. Join me again on Tuesday. And in the meantime, whether it's Little House or not, go out there and get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.